You're listening to the Penteract Poetry Podcast, hosted by Etherin.
Welcome to episode 18 of the Penteract Poetry Podcast. This is a visual poetry special featuring Laura Kerr, Rachel Smith, and Derek Beaulieu. It is co-hosted by Clara Daneri.
Okay, so let's get into it. First of all, just a short explanation about who you are and what you do and why you're here in this conversation. So let's start with Laura. Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. About myself, so I am a visual artist, and I started getting into poetry actually through Twitter. I went on Twitter a couple of years ago to meet other visual artists, and well, there was a lot of poetry, and that's really my first introduction to visual poetry. And it's funny because it's kind of a natural transition for me, because I've always used language in my art, words. So it was, hey, that's something I can do. And I love poetry, so I started getting at it more and more seriously, to the point where my students keep saying to me, when are you going to paint? Well, I paint, but not so much necessarily with the traditional medium. That's me.
So our second guest is Rachel Smith, who you may remember from episodes, what was it, 8? An earlier episode. So we've had your longer backstory explained, but if you could just offer something shorter now.
Okay. So I guess I came to poetry, again, I'm a visual artist, and really I came to poetry, in fact, through Derek, really, I'd like to say. So when I did my MA, I became aware of sort of conceptual writing and concrete poetry at that point. And so, yeah, and again, I've always used text in my artworks, but I've begun to found a more, a home in poetry. And I'm more interested sometimes in the conversations that seem to take place on that side of the border, sometimes than the conversations that takes place in visual art. So, yeah, I kind of like to have a foot in both camps.
Yeah. And Derek.
Hi, I'm Derek Beaulieu. I'm part of this podcast here from the side of Sleeping Buffalo Mountain in Banff National Park. I've been a writer in various forms for since 96, 97. So originally I was writing poetry that had more text, but as I started getting exposed particularly to the Canadian poet B.P. Nichol, when I combined his thinking with what I was encountering as an avid reader of comic books and of science fiction, and more and more it felt like treating language as something physical, as something that you could manipulate, that you could actually move, felt appropriate and fun and interesting, and it became a way of challenging what I thought language can do. And I think that that's a big part of what visual poetry is that it takes how we understand reading from one space and applies it to another.
Yeah, so this is very interesting because we've obviously got two people who have come to poetry from the visual art direction, and then you have gone the other way, which is something I relate to. I've talked on the podcast before about what I think visual poetry is and how we can understand it. And we all go with the familiar, so I try to compare it to constraint-based poetry, where you start with a rule, apply the rule, and then you move more and more towards a geometric ideal. In the case of constraint-based poetry, it's just trying to create some elaborate structure out of rules, stripping away meaning, really, semantic meaning. In the case of visual poetry, you're gradually looking at different qualities of language and stripping away semantic meaning until you arrive essentially at visual art. So I tend to think of visual poetry as the study of this area where you're slowly moving from language to the visual properties of language, in much the same way that constraints go effectively towards mathematics. I mean, is that just my particular fetish, or is that Derek, is that something you've found too when you moved away from semantic text?
Yeah, I do agree with much of what you're saying. I think that in large part, visual poetry is continues to be seen as the bastard child, or the redheaded stepchild of poetry. The thing that kind of happens on the side that nobody wants to talk about. But at the same time, it's not new. This has been part of a poetic tradition for thousands of years, and in a lot of cases, I think that our larger cultural lack of understanding around visual poetry is reflective of our education, and not of any sort of shortfall in terms of the poetic possibilities of visual poetry. And what I mean by that is that basically our teachers in a lot of cases have taught us what they were taught. And that tends, in my opinion, to come from the more conservative spaces of what poetics could be. And with that comes a lack of contemporaneity. We aren't looking at poetry as something that happens now. In a lot of cases, we look at poetry as something that happened then. And if you apply, like I said, I think that a contemporary teacher, somebody who is actually reflective of and thinking about how students read today, visual poetry becomes a natural extension of that, and isn't particularly shocking or abstruse at all.
Yeah, it's a shame that certain traditions have kind of taken over in the last couple of hundred years, and it's very difficult for other traditions to break through that. I like what you say, that it is ancient.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, think about going in the other direction, and from visual art to that semantic text. That is what happened. That's what language is. Mm-hmm. Language started with pictograms, and there was a great series on BBC recently. I don't know, maybe Rachel saw it. I think it was called The Secret History of Writing. And it talks about this, how pictograms evolved through something called the Rebus Principle, which is saying that you can use a picture of a bird for abstract concepts that begin with the letter B, and so on. And then, of course, because you can't keep drawing birds, the forms get simpler and simpler, and that's where glyphs come from. So I'd like to bring Rachel into the discussion here, because you've done a lot of work around the relationship between writing and drawing. So
yeah, and I was going to say it's about all writing is drawing, because at the end of the day we pick up a pencil and you're moving it about, and so what you draw is just, it might be something that looks more visual, but then words are visual. I mean, I don't even know how you can make those distinctions, because to say, oh well, then I'm drawing a picture of something, but I'm drawing a word. So yeah, my work is very much about, I think what was interesting, what you were saying at the beginning, Anthony, is you talked about movement and the movement of constraint-based poetry. And I think one of the things when I was trying to think about what I wanted to talk about in this podcast was, things about being experimental. It is about movement, and that's the thing that is key to my work, is pushing things in different directions and always exploring. I think what I'm interested in is the kind of the push and pull between abstraction and sort of the figurative, and whether that's in my drawing or my writing, I'm often pushing towards the epistemic or just the purely visual, but then pushing back in the other direction, because I guess because no matter where I'm sitting on the scale in the work that I'm making, I always want it to be the opposite, and so I'm constantly pushing the words to become less meaningful and then the images to become more abstract, and back and forth. And I'm very interested in what it means to be a maker while reading and writing, because for me those things are all interlinked.
Yeah, and so with going back to constraints, the more constraints I pile on top of each other, something has to go, and I'm quite happy if meaning is the first thing to go. I'm quite happy to allow nonsense if it's beautiful nonsense, or it's got this geometry.
Yeah, and we've spoken before about how I do love working with rules and constraints, but that error always comes into what I do, and I embrace that as a kind of as an interruption or a disruption of whatever's happening. So yeah, I like to break whatever's going on.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to see then if the three of you would agree that there is a relationship between constraint-based poetry and visual poetry. I mean, Laura, would you say you use constraints, or there's a constraint-based nature to what you do?
Well, yeah, definitely. But I want to touch on something first that Rachel was saying about how it kind of all does blend together to some extreme. When I'm working, and I've noticed this more lately, I will start with the idea that I'm going to do, it can even be an anagram, and I'll start working, and the finished results could end up being an animated video without words in it. So, but I start with the idea of the constraint, and I just go with how it leads me into another possibility in my work. I also will sometimes think I'm going to, well, sit down and do something I want to be visual, and it ends up being written poetry. So yes, it's all visual. I get that, but it's interesting how it will take on different forms, even in the process of making it, which I have been quite fascinated by, just that aspect of it in my own work.
Would you say it's a conscious effort to try to be, you're trying to do something new, and therefore you're having to bring in lots of different media? Animated visual poetry is quite interesting. I don't see a lot of that.
Yes, I guess for certainly. I mean, one thing I have always done in my own work as an artist is experiment. I mean, that's just my nature. It's an important part of my process, my art. And I have gone through different phases, different movements in my own artwork. And so, yes, definitely. I mean, I don't know if I set my mind to trying to make something that's experimental, but perhaps in the back of my head, I'm always trying to look at something in a new way, or to find a new end to something. So it's definitely, there's an aspect of exploring, but definitely I am always looking, always reading, always searching. I don't know about everybody else, but I mean, that to me is a part of my work too. It's like I'm the best art student because I'm always studying.
Yeah, well, it's important to be open to new things, isn't it? I like to say that I write constraint-based poetry, but I'm completely unconstrained when it comes to what I'm going to do. I have total freedom over the constraints, and I think that's important it's important in art in general.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And so, well, Clara, have you got anything to add to this?
Well, yeah, I guess I just had a bit of an open question for all of you, and I'm going to start with Laura because you touched upon it. To what extent do you think people are born experimental? Do you think it's something inherent within your creative process, or do you think it's something that can be learned or taught?
Oh, good question. If I thought about if I just look at my own work as a visual artist, I can think back as far back as I can recall. I have always been, number one, a visual learner, but also always experimenting and you know, I would break toys to find out how they worked as a kid. I mean, that's the type of child I was, and so experimenting. You know, I went to school, university in the 80s, and there were a lot of still conceptual art influences in our university at that time. A lot of the professors' work. So, I mean, I found that fast. I'm not a conceptual artist, but I love it, looking at it and thinking about it. But, you know, it was a very experimental university that I went to as far as that goes. So I fit into that aspect of it, and I've never stopped exploring I was a process artist for a length of time. It evolved into performance art, and it's all kind of related to conceptual art. So I think to some extent, yes, it would go with a person's nature. I don't think it's unteachable, but and I think it is rather important in art to be experimental.
Okay.
I think it works the other way, a bit like Derek was saying. You can be taught not to be experimental.
You like
But
have it beaten out of you.
Yeah, essentially, I think we're all born experimentalists.
Yeah.
And then somewhere along the way, people are taught not to be. But I think you hinted at that before, Derek.
Yeah, I think that absolutely experimentation can be taught. I think, once again, I think that a lot of students come into, or emerging writers come into a poetic discourse, in this case, or an artistic discourse, thinking that writing has to be what they've seen before. And in poetry, that often has to do with metrics, and it has to do with rhyme, and often has to do with emotion or personal confession, because that's what they've been exposed to. But that's with exposure to different types of forms, and with as an example, what I teach my students, what I ask them to do at the beginning of any course that I teach, is to picture a mental map of everything that writing could be. So in their head, they should have a map, and there's fiction and nonfiction and graphic novels and poetry and reporting and everything, playwriting, everything that writing can be is in this mental map of theirs. And that it's their job then to walk up to the edge of their map, which is, metaphorically the edge of their own understanding, and then jump off the edge. And add a little bit, add another inch, add another mile, whatever it might be, to what they think, to what that mental map is. Therefore, expanding what they think writing can be and what they think they can do. And that, to me, is the role, that's the artistic role of poetry or of experimentation, is to expand what we thought we could do. Now, that might be what you thought you could express, how you thought you could express it, the material of forms. I didn't know that poetry could be drawn or painted or sculpted. I didn't know that poetry could express these feelings. I didn't know that poetry could express under these constraints. Or I didn't know that poetry could express without expression, where there is no, content. And I think that encouragement leads particularly emerging writers to find a way of writing which is more aligned with what they want. Once they're freed from the idea that poetry must look a certain way or must act a certain way, and once they realize that emotion is actually not a material of poetry, it's a byproduct. This is not the tool you use, it's the result you get from the other tools that you use. Yeah. And that once you move past that, I actually think that the teaching of experimentation, to get back to what Anthony was saying, is students want to be unique. But at the beginning of a discourse, they want to be unique just like everybody else. And then eventually they realize that the risk of being unique just like themselves isn't as risky as they think, and that actually becomes somewhere that encourages others. And that to me, that's the key around experimentation, is that's what drives the art form forward, is that if you didn't think you could do it, if you didn't think the map included that, then probably other people didn't either. So just by writing, you teach.
I think that's quite interesting, because I think much like Laura, I came to visual poetry through Twitter, and I was like, it was almost like somebody gave me, I had no idea this existed, and somebody gave me permission to do it, and then I was like, wow, this is so amazing, and I let a lot of it sink in, and then I just had to come up with my own ideas. So I agree very much with what you were saying, Derek, that people almost need to just be shown there is another path. And Rachel, I was just wondering if you had anything to add, because you looked, I could see you reacting quite a lot to Derek's comments there.
I think it's just really interesting, isn't it? Because I think it is I was thinking when you were talking then, just like my experience of poetry at school was reading, I don't know, Cupid and Campaspe in some horrible old dusty room with books that just made my head hurt, and so it wasn't something that I thought I was interested in at all, but it is that about being expansive and always looking to expand the boundaries. And I think that's what's really interesting about what Derek's saying, is it's always about trying to just push the territory a little bit into somewhere else. And I guess for myself, you know, hybridity is so important, because it is about taking one thing that seems really fixed in its own discipline and putting it somewhere else, and then seeing what happens then, and what are the conversations that happen around this object when it's somewhere unfamiliar. So context is really important to me, and that idea of just moving things into places where they don't necessarily seem initially like they do fit. So I guess that was why I was nodding away with what Derek was saying, really, because it is just about, as an artist, I've ended up somewhere that I didn't expect to, but I'm happy to be here, kind of thing.
As an artist, if you end up where you thought you would be, then you're not an artist to me, because then you actually didn't, there was no learning, there was no discovery, there was only predictability. You thought you could do it, you ended up doing it, and you did it exactly the way you thought to. Well, you know, congratulations on accomplishing very little.
Yeah.
And teaching yourself nothing.
Yeah.
But if you started like, I don't know that I can do this, and I don't know how to get there, and the result is, well, I'll be damned. Well, that sounds a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
And that's what being an artist is.
But then you also have to stand somewhere where you don't feel that you belong to do that, almost, I think.
I think that's a really good place to start.
Yeah.
Which is why art, gathers, geeks and weirdos.
Yeah. Don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
So there is a distinction between standing on the edge and just pushing the boundaries, just seeing what else you can do. There's a difference between that and just trying to do something that you have absolutely no experience of.
Yeah, but they're still going to learn from it. There's no mistakes. And not only that, but it's still at the edge of their own knowledge. They don't know how to do it. They don't know it even if it exists, so they're going to try it. Great. Odds are, if you're learning something, we're learning something as your readers, and we can see the change. And there are no mistakes. It's just Beckett all the way down. It's like turtles. It's turtles all the way down. It's Beckett all the way down. Just fail and fail and fail and fail and fail better and do it again. And
Yeah. Well, that's a key point of experimentalism then, that there is no such thing as a mistake, really. There's no such thing as a poem that shouldn't have been written.
Yeah. And I think, Laura, you look like you want to say something.
Well, I'm thinking all the time that I just sometimes even give myself a pep talk, because you take risks, and with risks, I like you say, you can't make a mistake, but you're still diving into areas that are not familiar, and I work with that quite a bit in my visual poetry, to the point where sometimes I can't find my way back. I'm trying something so new that I haven't kept track of how I even got to the end result. It's so new, and it's exciting. I mean, that part of it is exciting, but there's always that risk. And I like Twitter, I have to say, because I put my little risks there, and sometimes kind of squeeze my eyes together and click and put it up there, and I like to, what people are thinking of my work and what the response to my work. Not that I need it. It's just that's one of the things I love about Twitter, is that it's so quick. There it is. It's out there. Too late. I can't take it back. Somebody's already commented on it or something, so it's there. Risk is definitely a part of my work, what I do. And that is really the pièce dans la résistance of art.
Mm-hmm. As you all know by now, I enjoy posting poems on Twitter, and it gets very frustrating sometimes when I post a poem that I think is really good, and then nobody seems to really go for it. So that can be annoying. And then it's also annoying the other way around sometimes, when I post something I don't think is very good and everyone likes it.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I've had that experience where something I'm not so crazy about, I'm not sure about, and that gets the better response than something that I'm very confident about, I'm excited for, come, look at this, and it's, dead air. So.
Yeah. Would that affect your practice at all? Does the audience reaction affect what you then go on to create? I think it's a question for everybody, really. Let's start with Laura.
No, not, well, I mean, I'm human, so it is nice. I can't have to admit when I get some really good positive feedback on something I've made. But no, sometimes I think it's possible that it's just too odd. And then I like odd stuff. So I think, okay, that's a little odd, what I did, what I made. And I'll sometimes even put something back on at a different time, 6 months later, and get a different response. So no, but I mean, Twitter is great for visual poetry. At least I find it a great social media for that. But yes, I mean, I work in my studio by myself, and there's a lot of work that doesn't go on Twitter. And I nothing has ever stopped me from making art, whether it's got popularity or not.
Rachel?
Yeah, I'm not as frequent a poster as Laura. I think Laura is amazing. She posts so much, as do you. But yeah, and I did take your recommendation to start posting on Instagram as well, which is interesting just to see what flies on Instagram and what flies on Twitter, even though it seems that I thought I had pretty much the same kind of following. But anyway, but I think it is interesting. I think it's always interesting to see what the audience brings back from whatever you put out there, because however you approach your audience, those kind of conversations, it doesn't mean I wouldn't make the work, but it is interesting to see how it makes me see the work differently, and then therefore that usually makes it grow in a different direction than I might have expected. So I'm always grateful for any kind of audience interaction, whether it's on social media or face to face or whatever, because I think it just makes you see your work from a different light.
Yeah.
I agree with you, but I don't think that the number of retweets or likes or thumbs ups. I really don't want to see that as an editorial tool that should predict or promote certain directions in my work. And I think that if to be snarky about it, I think that if you're being a poet so to become popular, you're in the wrong. You're in the wrong area.
No.
You need a new job, but
Yeah.
but that said, what drives me instead of the number of likes or the number of retweets gets closer to what Rachel was saying, and that is the community, and that's the conversation.
Yeah.
And that I keep leaning back on something that Margaret Avison has said, the Canadian poet said in the 60s, and that was the best response to a poem is another poem. Not the best response to a poem is a retweet, but the best response to a poem is another poem. What I want as a poet is a conversation, is write back, is reply, is take that work and do something with it. Is if I've done well, it's promoted you to write. It's promoted you to read. It's promoted you to critique or respond or think, or write a fan letter, or whatever, or try it yourself. I saw this work of yours online and I thought I'd give it a shot, and this is what I came up with. That conversation, that mentorship, and that community building, that to me, that's the best response to a poem. And so if I post something on Twitter and it gets nothing, so what? I don't think that's the role of Twitter, isn't to, like I said, to edit my manuscripts or teach me what's good or not. It's simply a dissemination tool. But if it leads to a conversation, if it leads to a contact with a new writer, if it leads to some sort of something else, now we're talking. And that to me is even beyond the role of, is this a good poem or is that a good poem, or what about this form or what about that form? Did it inspire a response? Did it push the conversation forward? Did it challenge what you thought poetry could do? Now we're talking.
Yeah. Well, Clara, you posted a poem recently and it did very well, but you were annoyed because it was just you said it was just a doodle and you didn't feel like it deserved to have attention.
We were having a bit of a session just messing around with some ink blocks and printing blocks and just creating some little visual poetry doodles, I suppose. And I liked one that was just quite attractive, and I thought I'd tweet it, and it was really popular, and it just kind of frustrated me that it became more popular than something I'd spent hours working on and had gone back to the drawing board and had scrapped and had taken me ages to come up with the concept for it. And I think that can sometimes be a bit frustrating because it links into what you were saying anyway, that it kind of felt, I don't know, I struggle with this sometimes with when I do, especially the little visual poetry things, I sometimes feel like I'm cheating, which I know I shouldn't. But it just felt like this was just me messing about on a lazy Sunday afternoon with ink blocks and just, I suppose, being free. I suppose it was a semic block printing, and it got more attention than most of my other tweets. So I don't know whether you guys can relate to that at all, but
isn't that interesting though, that it's somehow tied up in that is that you feel that for something to be successful, it has to be worked at really hard.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that I'm not guilty of that myself sometimes, because, I've spent a lot of time wanting to be a good student and doing a lot of study and those kind of things. But a lot of the time, the things that are really easy and free can be just as valuable, if not more, than the things that we've really, really struggled over. But it doesn't make either of them less or more worthy or worthwhile. Not worthy.
No, I guess I feel because I haven't come from. I've always done art in my spare time. I haven't been formally taught it. And like Anthony, my degree is in sciences. I do this as a hobby part-time. I guess it just makes me feel like, have I earned this? Which is, I know is terrible and I shouldn't, but I think a lot of people do.
No, and well, it doesn't that go back to, it goes back to what Derek was starting to talk about right at the beginning with, in terms of what your teachers are, where you come from, and therefore what you're aspiring to be and do and wanting to be accepted by a community. And I don't know, there's a lot of things tied up in that I guess we all feel at different times, maybe.
It's a guilt that you're having too much fun, because visual poets seem to be having more fun than most poets, I think.
We do.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Clara. I think once again, leaning on the classroom, the feeling that students have that the harder they work on something, or the longer they work on something, or even better, the harder and longer that they work on something, this is a measure of quality. Mm. So if they hand in a paper or a piece of writing to me, and I give it a poor grade, and they come back and say, but I worked a really long time on this. And I worked really hard. I cried and I sweated and I stayed up all night. And it's like, no, I put in a lot of work. And some of them are really shocked when my response is so. The amount of time does not equal the result. You can take a urinal and move it from here to there and sign your name on it. That takes about 25 seconds, and it takes no time at all. Or take a snow shovel and hang it from the ceiling. Done. The amount of time and the amount of energy doesn't equal quality. And it's not to get off here, it's a capitalistic myth that hard work pays off. That's bullshit. Hard work doesn't pay off. If it did, the current American president wouldn't be in office. And somebody holding, 5 jobs and working all the time and all that kind of would be. Hard work doesn't pay off. Smart work pays off. And hard work can pay off, but it's not the only path. And there is something to be said about inspiration, about play, about surprise, and about risk. And that print that you made on a lazy Sunday afternoon was all of those things. And I think that your readership saw that.
Mm.
And that's why it was retweeted as much as it was, is that they saw risk, they saw play, they saw you doing something that you didn't know how to do, and they saw you free. And that's what we want in art. That's why I got, why I got praised, as opposed to something that was perhaps over-labored or over-structured or overthought. It's like, put it aside and see what happens. Yeah. A gentle scolding.
But also, I'd like to add, you chose it. I mean, the fact that you said you looked at several prints, and there was something about that one print that caught your eye. So, you judged it as something that you wanted to take a step further and tweet.
Yeah, I get that. I suppose it's quite interesting to see that. That prompts a second question then to people who are potentially teetering on the edge of having a go at this kind of thing. What advice would you give people, I suppose, other than the just do it and see what happens? Is there any advice you could give to a budding visual artist looking to take those first tentative steps into having a go and sharing their work? I don't know who to go for first.
I'll chip in with just do it. Just go for it.
Absolutely. Share it. Print it, hand it out, give it away. Ask questions. Don't be afraid of your mentors. Reach out to people you admire and ask their opinion. Don't be afraid of getting critiqued. Just play. Just get out there. You have as much right to the conversation as anyone else. There is absolutely nothing that's preventing you from being an artist. There's absolutely nothing preventing you from being part of the conversation. So that's it. The only thing that's preventing you is yourself.
Right. I agree. If you want it, you've got to go for it.
And then I just want to pick up on what we were saying before about the selection process. Because we've talked about this on the podcast before. It seems it's a very important thing in all poetry and all art. But I think with the visual poetry, you see this a lot, that you have to have a good eye for your own work. You have to know which ones of yours you want to keep and which ones you're going to cast aside. And that's just as important as any other skill.
And how do you develop that skill? Let's get into that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know.
I think you develop that skill by looking at other people's work.
Mm.
And by looking at other people's writing, other people's artwork, and trying to determine for yourself what makes, like, why am I attracted to that painting and not this painting? What is it here that seems to draw my eye? And you can it's easier to hone your skills on other people's stuff than it is on your own. Because a person tends to be precious about their own writing, more so than about somebody else's. But what is it that draws you to that writer and not this writer? Well, I appreciate their diction, their metrics, their whatever it might be. It's like, okay, so if that is something you admire there and you don't see it over here, are you seeing that in your own work? You develop that eye by critiquing and editing other people's stuff, and by reading, or going to the gallery, or exposing yourself to artwork.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's a very good answer. Have anything to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I think, like you say, you've got to listen to other people. You've got to, I suppose, know what you like from other people and be able to see that in your own work. But it can be quite hard to be your own critic. And I think, like you alluded to when you talked about actually getting out there and posting stuff, actually don't be afraid to bounce off your colleagues whose opinion you trust, your friends whose opinion you trust, and say, I'm on the fence about this one. What do you think? What do you honestly think about it? And hopefully, if they're your friends, they'll be honest.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point. It's not so much how many likes and retweets you get. It's who's liking it and retweeting it sometimes. Is it someone whose opinion you hold in high regard?
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, you can take it one step farther. If somebody that you hold in high regard has liked it or retweeted, ask them why. You can write them and say, I'm actually pretty hesitant about this, and I saw that you liked it and retweeted it. Why'd you do that? And you might be surprised. They might say, well, because it's better than the crap that you usually publish. Or it could be like, because I've seen this and this, and it really surprises me,
And I think it's quite interesting as well, I suppose, again, reaching out to people who may be a bit hesitant. Don't be afraid to ask questions, because what we found on social media, it isn't always a good thing, but on the whole, people actually love being asked questions and being involved in the dialogue and having a conversation about art. Occasionally you might get horrible people, but you know what? There's a block function, so you don't have to worry about it.
The number of horrible people online is no more a greater fraction than the number of horrible people in the real world. It's just, it's just a different forum.
Yeah. Although I think sometimes they wouldn't say it to your face, but they're quite happy to hide behind the keyboard. So maybe you get a bit more aggression that way. But it's verbal aggression, so that's okay. They can't punch you through the top.
That's right. What do you think, Laura? How do you get out there? How do you develop that critical eye?
Well, I always tell my students that one of the most important things is knowledge. So you have to go look at art. You have to read about art. And not just look at picture books of art, but why the artists did what they did, so theory. And I can see students that may have lots of technique, like where they're very efficient with the medium that they work in, but they hit a wall. And the wall that they hit is because they know very little about the art that others have been making. Don't know, there's no art appreciation happening. So they make pictures, they develop their techniques, but it's lacking, and it doesn't go any further. So it is very important. I read, I can't get enough as far as reading art theory. It's something that I find very important. It stimulates my ideas, and criticism as far as critiquing art. That's one thing I actually miss as an art instructor is I want that. Sometimes, I'm doing a lot of art critique of other people's work, but I actually enjoy having a group look at my work and discuss it. Tell me its strengths, tell me its weaknesses. I want to hear how you see the work. I want to know how you converse with my work.
And Rachel, you bring philosophy into your work as well. So art theory, philosophy, it's all the ideas are there.
Yeah, I think it's in the same way as Laura is talking about. Sort of, she does a lot of reading, and I think for me, I'm always interested in bringing other ideas in, and the way for me to become critical or to critique your own work or to develop it is always to be almost butting up against ideas that push back against what you might think. It's too easy to be comfortable in what you do and to just surround yourself with people who nod and agree. What I find more interesting is when there is a bit of friction and people challenge you, and whether that's ideas or reading or other artists or other poets or discussions or just other philosophical ideas or whatever it is. I think it's good to be challenged to sort of, even if it is just to justify, well, why are you doing that? So that you're not always just feeling comfortable in what it is that you're doing, because not that, again, it shouldn't necessarily be really hard, but to think about why and what it is, why are you hanging on to certain things in the work that you make, and why not do something completely opposite or add something else in. So for me, that idea of reading and looking at other artworks and looking at other writers and again, philosophy and adding all of that into the process so that I'm constantly thinking about what is happening in my work, my artwork.
Yeah, and it's that multimedia idea again, isn't it? That it's very important to see art. I think anyway, it's important to see art as one field, just with these varied areas. One problem that you see with visual poetry is people completely dismissing it as poetry. We briefly mentioned this earlier. What's your natural response to people who say this?
I think they're in a rut. When somebody approaches something that maybe it's because they don't do it, they haven't taken time to even try to look at it, and they block it basically with they don't want anything to do with it because they've decided it does not fit their definition of what a poem is. They're in a rut. But I mean, at the same time, I don't think it matters so much to me that I have a huge audience. It matters to me that I have the right audience. In other words, I want to be around people that appreciate this way of thinking. Now, we might not all think, we might not all define what we're doing the same. We might actually all be working quite differently, but in the scope of experimental poetry, visual poetry, I look at your work, Anthony, and I see it tying very much so to visual poetry. And it's really encouraged me. I must say that I write a lot of anagrams. They don't make it onto Twitter, but I find it a great, I don't know, I read your anagrams and I find them very, it's just so cool. I just want to go and dive in and try to do that. So, but yeah, I think it's all about, I surround myself with the right audience. I'm happy with small numbers. It doesn't have to be mass amounts of or anything popular, because I don't think that's necessarily always the given. Popularity doesn't always mean it's good.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being so kind. It's not everybody is so kind. This is the trouble. Yeah, so I have had people who think that what I'm doing is an abomination and a corruption of what poetry should be, much as people would say the same about visual poetry. So, Derek, how do you deal with this?
Well, I mean, you can get it. You know, I have two responses. The first one I just said, and that's just fuck them. The other one is a little bit more intelligent, and that is that poetry is the attentive use of the smallest particles of language. And whatever your unit of composition is, and this you know, to get into it a bit, whether or not you're a poet or a writer that works at the level of the paragraph, or what's, you know, at the level of the essay, or the short story, or the paragraph, or the sentence, or the phrase, or the stanza, or the word. Once you get into it, poets are engaged at, you know, the level of the phoneme, you know, how it sounds, how it looks, the rhyme, all these various things. And visual poetry just uses a different, it's the same attentive use of language. Mm-hmm. It just tends to be either more granular or engaged with a different set of eames. You have, you know, the morpheme, the meaning, the phoneme, the sound. Visual poetry, for the most part, to be simplistic about it, is involved with a grapheme. And that would be the smallest mark. And so you have the smallest sound, you have the smallest meaning, you have the smallest mark, but it's all still engagement with language at the smallest particle. Mm-hmm. And so poets might bump heads, you know, arguing that no, you should be engaged with the level of the word. Or if you're a prose poet, you're engaged with the level of the sentence, or whatever it might be. Or you're, it might be the level of the rhyme or the metrics or whatever. But for visual poetry, tends to be, it's the grapheme. It's the smallest visual mark. So I don't think that it's. I think the poets have better things to do as to argue whether or not it's. And I've had the same issues. that people often with my work don't argue whether or not it's good poetry or bad poetry. They argue whether or not it's poetry at all.
Yeah.
And, fuck it. Poetry is what poets make. And, fine. And that to me is a-okay. Like what Laura was saying, Robert Creeley of all people, was saying that his audience was friends and maybe a couple dozen other poets. That's it. And you don't need a big audience. What I want is an engaged audience. I want people who actually are there to discuss. And if you think that it's garbage and you can actually convince me, great. I'm not above criticism by any means. And I'm not saying that every project I've worked on is bulletproof, but every one of them has tried to push me around. And that's why I did it. And maybe it pushes you around too. And I would like to think that poets want to explore the limitations of what they think language can be. And if you are already limiting yourself to saying, no, it can only be this, then you need to do your homework. And you need to be looking at the areas that you don't recognize. And it's like, no, poetry can only be about daisies. Well, then maybe it's time that you look at some sunflower poetry. Like maybe it's time for you to push outside of whatever that can be to make yourself a better poet.
Right.
Yeah, and it's so ahistorical too, that because as you said earlier, visual poetry has been around for a very long time.
Right.
Constraint-based poetry has. Palindromes are over 2,000 years old. All these things have been around much longer than the current trends.
Yep.
So it's very ignorant to tell people that what they're doing is not poetry.
Yeah, it's out of fear. It's based out of fear. It's because if they don't recognize it as poetry, it suggests that they are missing a piece of their education, that they've missed something, that they will be afraid of being called out as not appreciating spaces that they could. I think that's with everybody. I think it's just a fear-based response. Being seen as uneducated, or maybe being seen as uncool, or somewhere on that line. I wouldn't worry about it too much. And not only that, but all reviews are good reviews. You get a scathing review in the Times Literary Supplement. Congratulations. The fact that they even noticed, that's the point. Like what was being said, what I've recently heard in another meeting is the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. So if they love your work, great. If they engage with your work online and spending countless hours telling you how much they hate you,
yeah.
Measure that by the amount of passion that they are expending into this.
They're a fan.
Yeah, they're absolutely. The silence is more. That's the dismissive point. They have nothing to say. That's way more interesting than hate mail or whatever. Who cares?
Yeah.
All reviews are measured by the inch, not by the praise.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that it's just such in a way, if people are sort of saying it's not poetry, I don't really, I suppose maybe it's because I come from a visual art background, perhaps, I don't know, and maybe Laura might back me up or completely disagree, but I don't know, I guess because in art, all of the rules were smashed up so long ago that it almost becomes difficult sometimes to even make art because, well, everything is art. It kind of makes it difficult almost to move because you just everyone's like, yeah, like Derek says, I just don't care. So what? And so in a way, and all of the time I talk about pushing boundaries and we've talked about finding an audience and surrounding yourself with people who are interested and engaged and maybe challenge you. But really, we're talking about a map. And on this map there is room for everybody, and it's just we're all in different places, and like we were saying earlier about, well, why do you like that, why are you drawn to that and not that, and isn't this just all part of that bigger conversation about where you find yourself on the map? And we gather people around us, or we gravitate to different places because that's what interests us. So maybe they're just maybe they just got a bit lost.
Yeah, it's such a strange thing, really, to say to worry about whether it's poetry or not, because
It's
still a thing.
No.
You know.
Mm.
Do you like it or not? That's a more important question than what category do you want to lump it in.
Yeah, not how do not do it should be. Do I like it? Not well. How do I read it?
But it kind of reminds me of when I'm in an art gallery at times and I'm sitting looking at a painting. Like there's a bench. I sit down. It's a painting that I'm finding very engaging. And I look around and I realize nobody else finds this painting. I'm alone in this room. And yet in the next room, they're all gathered around something else. And I realize that poetry is very much like that. It's not going to appeal to everybody, and it shouldn't, when you think about it, right? And that gets back to that small audience. And also as far as loving something, hating something, to me as an artist, if I can get you to stop and look, I've succeeded. The rest is icing on the cake. But if I can get you to stop.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I kind of had a question. I know that for me, one of the things I found really amazing about visual poetry is it's encouraged me to approach various different media, both physical and digital, in different ways I hadn't thought of trying before. And it challenges me to go out of my comfort zone with those things, and it's really interesting to experiment in that kind of way. So I was wondering how the rest of you felt about that. Did you feel that it's changed your relationship with media? If I start with you, Laura.
Oh, definitely. At first, I have to say that I guess primarily if I had to call myself something, it'd be a painter. And so I did use a lot of painting and drawing first, and some encaustic work, took photographs of it, and then would manipulate it digitally. That was how I came through my process originally. It was almost like I didn't want to leave the traditional mediums and go 100% into the digital. And in fact, I've often taught my students that it's more exciting to hand make something and then digitize it, because it's a step that someone else can't do, right? It makes it a little more original. And so I did that. And now it's almost 100% digital with just photography. So, which is also digital photography. So in terms, I guess it's still 100% digital. So I'm quite surprised at myself, really, that it's evolved into that. But I'll tell you something I am doing right now that I'm exploring is I have so many apps on my computer to do with digital art that I use many of them, but I try to use them the way they weren't intended. So I'm trying to find new ways of using it, which is very like my own traditional art, where if I was doing watercolor, I always wanted to manipulate that color, that medium, unlike it was supposed to be, to change how it is applied. And that was the experimental stage. So now I'm doing that with my digital art. Is I want to manipulate these apps and use them in a way that nobody else would be using.
Are there any particular, I always love finding out about new art and gadget apps. Are there any you would particularly recommend? I understand I'm putting you on the spot here, but
No, there is one that's a lot of fun. It's called Luminous. I think that's the name of it. I can always give it to you if I'm wrong at another time. I think it's Luminous. And it is so you take your videos and you manipulate your videos in this glitch. It's a glitch making app. But what I don't like I don't like the obvious glitch work. Like, I don't want it to look like the app did everything. And it was like just sort of plugged in my art, and then the app just did it all. So this one has more features that I can manipulate and use wrong. It's the only way I can explain it. I use them in a way that they aren't intended. And every time I succeed at that, it's like, aha, I did it. I managed to do something, and half the time I can't repeat it. In other words, I can't make it again, which is even more exciting because it's a fluke, right? So it's a real glitch.
Would you say accidental processes are important to your work? Because we've got Rachel here who that's
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's all part of experimenting, isn't it? I mean, it's that eureka moment. Oh my goodness, look what I did. That's not even what I was intending to do. God, I hope I can repeat that. That kind of thing. I find that all very exciting. So it's kind of, is that the opposite of constraint? I don't know.
Well, that's interesting, because constraints, really, when you apply constraints, things appear that you wouldn't think of intentionally.
Okay.
So in a way, it's the same thing, but
right.
Yeah,
but,
I think it's more like, well, it's a different thing, but it's also the same. That's a terrible answer, but it's
same family.
Yeah.
Same family.
Well, they're more similar than people like to believe, aren't they? I think people would tend to say that if it's constraint based, then you should be sticking to the rules and accidents shouldn't be allowed. But you're right, because they do just
all an accident to some extent.
Yeah.
And I guess then to you, Rachel, I mean, do you feel that your relationship with the media you've worked with has changed through your practice and grown, and in what ways has that been interesting and exciting, if it has happened?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, in the same way that you were asking Laura in terms of in being introduced to visual poetry and so on. So I suppose for me, the biggest change with my work became that I suddenly discovered what it was to make work in a book, which massively altered the scale and the sort of the quantity of the work and how it sort of related to different aspects of it. So rather than just traditionally, I'd use photography and drawing and was much more interested in the gallery wall. And so to start to think about the book as a space, it has become really interesting to me. And now at the moment, because obviously the PhD is behind me, and so suddenly I feel a lot freer and more experimental in what I'm doing at the minute. And so I guess I'm back to that thing that interests me the most, which is pushing work into a book and then out of a book, and having drawings larger and on the wall, and then thinking about how they might end up back in a book with text, and drawings that become text and then become drawings, and those kind of relationships. But yeah, I think the most exciting thing for me is to come out of all of this as being the book form itself, and actually seeing my work inside a book and navigating that space, which is so very different to a wall or a gallery. Yeah,
and I suppose in a way that the book itself becomes a constraint, doesn't it? It's very, very much a constraint. It's interesting.
But there are, but again, you almost curate the way the book is structured in terms of the way you want your audience to approach it. And in some respects, I guess you have perhaps more control over the audience, but maybe not, because they can still just pick it up. But the audience understands a book in a way that they know they have a structure, and they think they know how to navigate a book. So I'm interested in playing with that as well.
Yeah, so the book almost becomes like a gallery wall. You display the art in the order which you expect, but you then can't force people down that path. You just anticipate that they will.
Yeah, I guess. But and then I'm interested. I mean, in the book that you have kindly published, it's also playing with that idea of, so some of the visuals in there are folded pages, but they're actually flat. So I'm very interested in that idea of illusion within photography and what that can create in amongst the pages of a book.
I mean, I guess from my perspective, like Laura and Rachel, I blur traditional and digital art quite a lot, and I think for me the thing I like is I like to, like you were talking about, Laura, earlier on in your practice, I like to start with a physical traditional thing and then manipulate it digitally, because I always found that if I tried to start something first principles digitally, I got so hung up on it being perfect, because you can't you? You can zoom into the pixel level. I got so obsessed with it being perfect. I never got anything done, and I really wasn't enjoying it. So now I enjoy the margin of error that comes from having a physical paintbrush, or I like using lino, printmaking and things like that. So the inherent variability of that I like, but then I'll just maybe enhance colors or things like that digitally. But then again, some of my things are completely digital. And again, I like using things like they're not supposed to. I use a 3D modeling software, and I use that to render poetry onto models. So you've got these things that you can almost, I'd like to eventually get to stage where I could 3D print them. You have poetry rendered onto skins that then become these 3D models that are translucent, and I really enjoy that process.
And onto dragons.
Dragons most recently, yes.
Most recently.
Oh wow. Yeah. You know.
So yeah, I that's why I like my art apps.
Yeah, I'll probably return to, I quite like encaustics. So I find actually a few years back, and I might try it again, I actually did a digital artwork on the computer, and then I hand painted it and covered it in encaustic wax and made it into another type of artwork. So I just basically, I'm taking prints off of my printmaker and collaging it and covering it with painted wax, and I found that kind of neat. And then they were meant to go on a wall, of course. I might use it to take photographs of, and then another layer of digital work on top of that. So it'll be digital, traditional, digital. See what happens.
And that's the point, isn't it? See what happens.
Yeah.
So at the end of every podcast, we like to give people the opportunity to plug something or say what they're working on next. You know, if you want to talk about what you're working on, and if there's anything you want to try to sell to people, Rachel.
Oh, I have that book.
Oh, do you? Oh, yes,
Yeah.
you said, yeah.
Yeah.
And what did you think?
Oh, it's fantastic. I don't know, there's almost like I have to say, like a de Kooning kind of Miro-ishness to your work. Have other people said that to you before?
No, that's really interesting. I really like that.
Sort of the scripty hand the marks and everything. I just love it. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'd like to add, I just like for people who don't know Rachel's works, it always to me feels very 3D and tactile, even when it's printed on the page. There's a real depth to it, and you can really feel how you've touched and engaged with the work, and it's tactile while still a 2D image, and I find that really fascinating. And the way you play, like you say, you play with borders, don't you? Things go off the edge of the page and things are swapped round, and it's really a playful way, I think, to look at work, isn't it? And it shows a love and appreciation and a depth of the subject matter.
Well, thank you. And I think I frightened Anthony to death because he kept sending me the proof for my book that I am trying to plug, but with the fact that it went over the edges, and instead of the things being double page spreads, they went from the verso to the whatever, which the left to the right and the right to the left. And I know you were very concerned about the bits that got lost, but I guess that's just part of the process, and I've become so used to working in that way. And when you are making those kind of books in that kind of the printmaking process, you do lose things, and so I'm quite happy for that to happen, because it becomes part of the error in the work that is intrinsic, really. But I'm pleased that you say that, because obviously materiality for me is really, really important, and so I love that. Laura talks about the sort of the physical and the handmade things, and then scanning things and making them digital and backwards and forward. And so yeah, it's really important to me that in that sort of leap from the thing that is made to the thing that is scanned or photographed and then printed digitally, it still maintains that kind of really tactile quality that is really important, because that's kind of how I think.
I have a question for you, Rachel. Just out of curiosity, I know that you are a visual poet and you've published books with your work. Do you still make large pieces of art for the wall or sculptures as well?
I'm starting to again now. I think because obviously a lot of the work that I've been doing recently has come out of the PhD study research that I did. It had become very book based because it was kind of within that kind of remit. But yeah, now I am starting to sort of think about my more drawings and text work that is bigger and appearing on walls again. And so, and I'm hoping to start to work more on that kind of thing, and look at that idea of the book almost being opened up onto the wall and then back and folding back into it again. So yeah, but I'm very interested in fragments and sort of then thinking about them as a larger assemblage, I think, at the moment.
I know before COVID hit all of us, I was planning on doing an art show. I have a small gallery, and I wanted it to be a poetry that is on the walls and is on pedestals, but poetry. And I wanted artists poets, right, to think of a way that would look and still be poetry, more so than perhaps both visual art and poetry, maybe poetry. I wanted it to be something that was kind of a new way of putting poetry into the gallery context. I had to abandon it because I didn't want, I was excited about it, and I want to have a crowded gallery where people could mingle freely, and I had a lot of people interested, and I still want to do it. So that's something that I'm always thinking about.
And Derek.
Sure. I would encourage listeners of this podcast to seek out a book that I created in collaboration with our two hosts this evening. Seek out Aperture from Penteract Press, a series of day-glow visual poems created with Dead Media, and then that edition will have a sequel coming out of the UK's Gimo Press in the Christmas season as well. That moves that day-glow series into basically a sequence of 1970s disco wallpaper.
Okay, so that's it. Just leaves. Thank you. You're the first panel we've done like this, and it was really worth it.
I think that's worked really well. So, yeah, thank you. To discover more, visit us at penteractpress.com.